We are wrapping up our series through the book of Genesis. This has been 35 messages over 8 months that it's taken us to go through this, and today is the last day. And as we dive into Genesis 50, we're going to see what Genesis prepares us for in our life. Let's check it out. Well, good morning. Hey, we are so glad that you are here today. Before we jump into it, I just want to invite you, if you are new today, we love to meet you at the tent right after service. Just say hi and have a little gift thanking you for joining us this morning. But today, I'm excited. There's a lot going on today, but I heard it's very lame kind of. Well, it was a happy woohoo, just like a sad woohoo. Like it was happy, but it was only one, so it was sad. But before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about last Tuesday. And if you were here, some of you guys texted me that you guys were sick and missed that thing, and others, that last Tuesday we had a prayer summit here, and it was our first prayer summit we've done. And as we've talked about more and more of working this prayer culture into the life of our church, and it was powerful. And it was amazing. And God answers prayers. And one of the things that was cool coming out of that is people don't know what to hear when they hear prayer. Like some from a church background think maybe like, okay, I don't want to stand in a circle and hold the dude's hand, right? I was a kid, remember going to like those prayer meetings at my old church, a little traditional, and I'd always like the biggest, sweatiest dude. I'd have to hold his hand, right? And be like, bro, no offense, but this prayer's going on too long. I don't want to hold your hand anymore. It wasn't like that at all, okay? And I got lots of comments after that. I was like, that was a lot less weird and a lot more powerful than I was expecting. And I'm like, yeah, it really was. And so I want to encourage you, mark your calendars, and we're going to talk about it more as we get closer. But March 7th at 6 o'clock, it's a Tuesday night. That is our next prayer summit. And I encourage you to be there because this is where God changes lives, right? Like we have good music. I'm mildly entertaining and put sentences together. But how the kingdom grows is through the power of God and us petitioning him to move in our church and in our city. So March 7th, mark your calendar. Prayer Summit is our next one. And last week we had further proof that God answers prayers, even not prayers that are righteous, because the Suns landed Kevin Durant last week. So I can't say I was praying for the past 8 months. I do separate that, but I know Suns fans who were, and it happened, okay? So if anyone had on their bingo card how long it would take me to bring up Kevin Durant, it was soon. But anyway, today is actually a big day because we are wrapping up and ending our study through the book of Genesis. And if you've been with us, this has been an awesome journey. And it's been a long journey, to be honest. We have been studying this book, took a little bit of breaks a few times, but we've been studying this book for 8 months. And over 35 different sermons, over 4 different kind of series of messages. And this has been just a powerful journey. And if you've been with us, I think you've seen some of this as we've just dug into this book. We've just kind of seen some of the depth of wisdom that is in here. And it has been just so awesome, just kind of as we come to the end of the beginning of the Bible. Right? Genesis literally means beginning. And today we're kind of coming to the end of it and seeing how this book wraps up. Now, if you hear that and you're like, I haven't been here, I encourage you, you can go on YouTube and you can just like binge it. Like I talk to a lot of people that would literally do that. I'm like, I would get tired of my voice after very long at all. Just ask my wife. But I'm like, but you can go and you can listen to myself and our other leaders who have preached through this book and just seen kind of this journey that's gone through this. But today, as we dive into the final chapter and the final message of this, I want to recap something we said at the very beginning. And it is this, that the book of Genesis, it introduces us to the God of the universe who is also the Lord of our life. You see, here's what's so cool about the book of Genesis, is that right off the bat introduces us this God who created everything. And there are so many lessons to learn about the fact that we are created, that our universe is created. It wasn't random, it wasn't crazy, it didn't just pow, it happened, but it's ordered. And this God of the universe who meticulously created all of this is also the Lord of your life, also meaning he cares about really small things like you and me. And as we've gone through this journey, we've been able to see that. And it's been like this master class of introducing us to this God who is big, but this God who is small. We started this actually, and if you go to the beginning of Genesis in the first few chapters and you see the creation account, we see how God created the universe. But not only just like in the universe, he created the stars, he created planets, and then it goes down to the earth, and we see how he created the earth. He spoke it into existence. He created the land and the sea, the fish, the birds, and the animals. But then it points to the pinnacle of creation and mankind. In the detail that he gave to creating mankind, in the word that's used to describe the name of God in those first couple chapters is Elohim, this powerful God, this great God who is eternal, that if you think on too long and you think on too hard, your head might explode, okay? I say this as a personal knowing this. Like when I think about eternity and God being big too long, it hurts my head because I like to understand something fully, and we can't even understand him fully because he's so huge. But then Genesis kind of takes a shift. And starting in Genesis chapter 3 and continuing on, we start to see God intertwined in the lives of people. We see how he talks and he works through the life of Adam and Eve. And then from them, he works with this guy named Seth, their son. And from Seth, we hear the story of Noah. And from Noah, we get to Abraham and Sarah, the father and the mother of the faith. And from them, we get to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and then to Jacob's sons, and ultimately Joseph. And the word, the name that is used to describe this God is Yahweh, the God who knows us, who wants a relationship with us. And today, as we begin to dive in and wrap up this book that's kind of, Genesis is really volume 1 in a much bigger book known as the Bible, we're given some preparation for some things that we are going to see. And today, I want us to spend some time looking at what does Genesis prepare us for? If you have your Bibles, go and flip to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis 50, this is the last chapter of the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 50. And as we get into this, I was like kind of, as I'm writing these words this week, and as I was like praying over this, kind of this illustration, this feeling popped in my head. Of as we wrap up the book of Genesis, it's almost like a high school or a college graduation. And have you ever experienced that? High school, there's like this celebratory aspect. Like you're like, man, I've done all this work. I've spent all this time, right? Like, I spent all these 6 years graduating high school. No? Okay, just kidding. But it's like you put all this effort in, all this work, you've learned all this knowledge. And then it's led to this moment of celebration. We're like, yes, I've done it. I'm going on. But then you leave high school or college and you realize I know nothing, right? And then I'm like launching into the world where I feel like very ill prepared, but I still have a foundation to what I built through that time that now I'm going to pile on top of that. And honestly, the book of Genesis is very similar. If you read the book of Genesis and you're like, I don't need the rest of the Bible, yeah, you're going to be pretty woefully unprepared. One, it ends kind of on a cliffhanger. And then two, you're like, okay, like what do I do with the rest of my life? But it's actually just the foundation for which the Bible will continually build upon for years to come. And as we kind of wrap this up and we see this, it prepares us for the epic journey that is coming in the rest of Scripture, but it also prepares us what we're going to face in our everyday lives. And we're going to start seeing this today in how the book of Genesis, it prepares us of what we're going to face in our lives, how we will face and see that the presence of death is everywhere. Genesis chapter 50, starting in verse 1, it says, "Then Joseph, leaning over his father's face, wept and kissed him. He commanded his servants who were physicians to embalm his father. So they embalmed Israel. His father Israel, also known as Jacob, he's passed away, and they're kind of getting into his burial and funeral." Verse 3, it says, "They took 40 days to complete this, for embalming takes that long. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. When the days of mourning were over, Joseph said to Pharaoh's household, 'If I have found favor with you, please tell Pharaoh that my father made me take an oath, saying, I'm about to die. You must bury me there in the tomb that I made for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go and bury my father, then I will return.' So Pharaoh said, 'Go and bury your father in keeping with your oath.' Verse 7, then Joseph went to bury his father, and all Pharaoh's servants, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt went with him, along with all their Joseph's family, his brothers, his father's family. Only their dependents, their flocks, and their herd were left in the land of Goshen." horses and chariots went up with them. It says it was a very impressive procession. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, which is across the Jordan, they lamented and they wept loudly. And Joseph mourned 7 days for his father. When the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians. Therefore, the place is called Abel Mizraim. It is across the Jordan." Verse 12. So Jacob's sons did for him what he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan. They buried him in the land of Machpelah, in the field near Mamre, which Abraham had purchased as burial property from Ephron the Hittite. And after Joseph buried his father, he returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone with him to bury his father. Benjamin Franklin once said that there's only two things for certain in life. It's death and it's tax season. Like 3 of you knew that, okay? Come on. Death and taxes. It's also Super Bowl Sunday. One time, Chad Ochocinco, used to be Chad Johnson. I don't know if he changed his name back, but he used to say the third inevitable thing was that 85 was always open because he was number 85. Okay, that one went over your head. But when we see this, death, here's the point. Death is an unavoidable part of life. And as we're kind of wrapping up the book of Genesis and we dive into chapter 50, we're met with death. And there's two, and a little side note here, there's 2 exceptions to death being avoidable in life. And we actually see this in the Bible. One character, when we studied through Genesis, was a man named Enoch. And then later on in the Old Testament, we see a man named Elijah, who was a prophet of God. And literally it says that God brought them up to heaven. That must have been the craziest experience ever. They didn't just die. God's you've lived long enough. I don't want you to die. I like you guys. And he just scooped them up to heaven. I'm that'd be a super way to cool. And it'd be a little nuts. But other than that, death is unavoidable. Day in and day out, death is everywhere. And no matter how prepared for it, death is hard. This past month, I preached my 3rd funeral for my grandparents. I got 1 left. So 3 of my 4 grandparents, I've preached funerals for over the last, 5 years. And no matter how prepared I am for those times, no matter how much I saw it coming, and they lived good, full lives and sicknesses overtook them, and even in some cases, no matter how much almost you welcome it, because in the end, they weren't the people they were before, and you could tell there was hurt there. No matter how much you prepare for it, it still hurts. It's still hard. It's still those emotions you wrestle with, those things you have to prepare. And here we kind of see this idea that death is the hardest for those who are left behind. And the picture we get in Genesis chapter 50 is a picture from the viewpoint of Joseph and his brothers losing their father, Jacob. In verse 1, it says, Joseph, he's leaning over his father's face, and he wept and he kissed him. He's there at his father's dying moments, and he's pouring out his heart. They grieve. And it talks about his brothers in this, that they continue to mourn. But as they mourn, they also start move into making plans and arrangements to honor their father. In verse 12, we kind of get that summary that says, so Jacob's sons did what he had commanded them, and they buried him in the land of Canaan. In verse 14, it says, after they buried their father, they returned to Egypt with his brothers, and they had gone, all who had gone with him. And here's why you're okay, where are we going with this? But this is what I think is just crazy. And what's so interesting to me about all this passage is fast forward to 2023, and you read this passage, and then you think of your own personal experience, this is a lot how we handle death today. There's grief, there's celebration, there's remembrance, there's honoring last wishes and honoring legacy, and ultimately there is being together with family. But just think about that a little deeper, because this took place over 4,000 years ago. That's a long time. 4,000 plus years ago, and we haven't figured out a better way to deal with death. Despite how much our society advances, our technology has advanced, all the things we have and how smart we think we have gotten, we are equally prepared to deal with death as people were thousands of years ago. And on the other side of death, we actually see how Jacob was more prepared and more equipped to face death than the majority of our people today. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21, we get the viewpoint of Jacob as he's dying before his sons here mourn him. And it says this, that by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, he blessed each of his sons and the sons of Joseph, and he worshiped leaning on the top of his staff. You see, when Jacob was face to face with death, he wasn't scared. He wasn't regretful. He wasn't spiteful and angry and says, I wish I had done this. I wish these kids weren't such jerks. We actually covered that last week where he talks about some of the kids like, you made mistakes, you're going to pay the price. But he doesn't get mad at them for that. Instead, we get an amazing example of those who experienced death in a way that they knew it was coming, but it strengthened their faith instead of weakening it. You see, Genesis is just this beautiful picture of these deaths we've seen of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob here, of how when they were faced with death, how they just trusted and worshiped God all the more. But you see, Genesis not only prepares us for death, but it also prepares us for the problem of sin. Let's keep reading in verse 15. It says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to one another, if Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering that we have caused him. So they sent this message to Joseph and said, before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph, please forgive your brother's transgression and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of God, your father. Joseph wept when their message came to him. His brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You plan evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. You see, when we talk about this idea of sin, this is a word we use all the time in church. And sin is actually a pretty basic word. In its most elementary, kind of rudimentary term, it's an archery term for all you archers out there, right? A sin literally means to miss the mark. So it's like when you set up like a target, I think this is what you do with bows and arrows. My knowledge completely comes from watching Legolas and Lord of the Rings when it comes to bows and arrows. Yeah, right? Where's our woo? That was weird. I might think because Legolas, okay. My mom used to think Legolas was beautiful as we watched those movies, so that's what I just pictured right now. Anyway, so there's a target out there, and when you miss that target, it is a sin. And think about this in our personal lives, is we set a mark for our lives. You're like, okay, I'm gonna be nice to my kids. I'm gonna be sweet and loving to my wife. I'm not gonna flip anyone off while I drive. And like you set these marks for your life, and it's going good when you wake up in the morning, right? You like get your cup of coffee, you smile at your family, like it's a great day, right? And like maybe if you're lucky, you get out of your house and you're still happy. But then you run into traffic. Then you run into that coworker you can't stand. Then all of a sudden you get an email or a text of something you fixed and did, and someone screwed it up, and now it's gonna be your entire day fixing it. And all of a sudden your mark of being loving and kind and nice and Mr. Rogers quickly becomes angry. And all of a sudden you're not so kind to people. All of a sudden you wanna rip into someone. All of a sudden you wanna deal with some consequences. And then when we do those things, and the thoughts in our heads, which is already sin, as Jesus says, but all of a sudden they start fleshing out in our heart and our actions, we've missed the mark. And you see, the Bible tells us and makes very clear the marks of holiness that God has set for us, that we continually miss and fall short of. You have the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament. That's why he gave them to us. Jesus summarizes that and says, love God and love others. And if you do these things, you'll keep the entire law. But when we try to love God and love others, life gets in the way, and we continually fall short to miss the mark, to sin. And the problem is that this gets amplified when we increasingly miss those marks in severity and in frequency. We continue to sin, and often, if you're like me, you continue to sin in the same thing over and over again, and it frustrates you, right? That's why we have like Celebrate Recovery, because usually we don't make a lot of mistakes. We usually make the same mistake over and over and over and over again and can't keep it, right? Or you make a huge mistake and it really jacks up your life, and then you got to pick up the pieces. And when this happens, here's the result of that. Then shame and guilt start to come over us. And when that shame and guilt comes over us, we don't know how to handle it. We don't know what to do with it. But here's how we handle it. And then the best way to deal with shame and guilt as a result of our sin is we reconcile and we get forgiven by our God. But here's a huge problem of sin that is just really terrible. I would say there's kind of two parts to this. First, sin separates us from God. And ultimately, our sin breaks our relationship with him. But here's why sin is so terrible and bad, is even when God forgives us and we're back with him and all of a sudden we're good with God again, there's a voice in the back of our head that says, but no, he didn't really forgive you. That person didn't really forgive you. Like, you are screwed up. You are messed up. You are a bad person. Like, they may say they forgive you. Yeah, you may pray and you felt like God forgive you. You may say it in his Bible, but Satan lies in our mind and says, but you don't truly deserve it. And it didn't truly happen. You see, even when we are forgiven on this side of heaven, it's hard to completely get rid of that guilt and that baggage. And why I say all this, you're like, that's like a really random rant. No, it's exactly what happened and what we just read here today. That in the story of Joseph and his brothers, and if you weren't here recently and don't know what happened, essentially, they all grew up, 12 brothers together. Joseph was the favorite. He made his brothers mad. They sold him off into slavery. He went to Egypt. He had a horrible life in so many ways, but he kept trusting God. He kept on being faithful, and eventually, he rose to the number 2 position in all Egypt. Horrible famine happened across the known world, so his brothers have to go to Egypt to buy food. Joseph immediately recognizes, he sees them, and everything in his mind 20 years later be like, I should kill these fools. Like, I'm payback, there's a word for that. He's like, this is my time. And so Joseph forgives them. And so Joseph moves his entire family, all his brothers and sisters, his father, everyone they're related to Egypt. Gives them land, shows them more grace than they ever could have. And then fast forward a few more years later, their fathers died, and in the back of their mind like, oh, I know Joseph forgave us, but I think that's just because dad was alive. So let's fall on our knees because we're not worthy. And that guilt and that shame just kept bringing them back. Satan kept whispering in their ear, be like, hey, Joseph's not that good of a guy. He's gonna kill you now. Like, dad's not watching, it's okay. And we hear that all the time. And this is just a sobering picture of how Satan works, is he wants to convince you that God doesn't fully forgive you. He wants to convince you that the people you love don't fully forgive you when you hurt them. And they're just putting on a sweet face when there's still animosity that they're holding on to. You see, Joseph's brother in this story had a moment of weakness that they believed all of this was fake just to appease their father. But Joseph, again, gives us a true picture of Jesus here. And I just love it when they bring all this to him, when they say it, he wept when he heard their message, and he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. He's like, I will forgive you again. I know what you did was terrible. But he's like, it's okay. And the problem of our sin is not just that it separates us from God, but it continues to try to separate us from God when we let that guilt pull on us. And there will always be lies that creep up from your past, and they will try to derail your relationship with God. They will try to tell you you're not good enough. They will try to tell you you're not past those consequences, but God tells us something different. And as we wrap up in this story of Genesis, we just see this beautiful picture in this instance. We get this beautiful reminder that we can see ourselves in the brother's shoes, that when we question our salvation, when we question if God really loves us, if God really forgives us, we see his answer in Joseph that God says, don't be afraid. You're forgiven and you're safe here. Which leads to the final thing that we learn from the book of Genesis, and that it prepares us for the promise of a new life. Let's keep reading in verse 22. And it says, Joseph and his father's family remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years. He saw Ephraim's son, that's one of his sons, to the third generation. The sons of Manasseh, his other son, Machir, were recognized by Joseph. In verse 24, it says, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid, and he will bring you up from this land, to land he swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt. It's now at the end of this chapter, it's now Joseph's turn to face the other side of death. He had to face death when his father's on his deathbed, but now the tables have turned, and Joseph is sitting here on his deathbed. And as he is, just like his father, he isn't worried, he isn't scared, he isn't angry, he isn't regretful or mad about how life turned out. He didn't turn to his brothers and be like, hey, you remember when you threw me in that pit? Yeah, that was a real jerk move, man. He didn't do any of that. Instead, we actually get his mindset in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. It says, by faith, Joseph, as he was nearing the end of his life, he mentioned the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions concerning his bones. You see, think about this for a second. Life was good in Egypt. Joseph was vice pharaoh. His family was taken care of. The rest of the world hurt after famine, but Egypt just became more wealthy and more rich, and they started to benefit from that wealth. They had a comfortable life, and they had it set. But Joseph tells them, no, something better is coming. A new life is coming for our people. Something bigger, something greater. As I picture this story, and I almost see Genesis as a movie, these are the closing credits. And if Genesis was a movie, it'd be a really long movie. I mentioned Lord of the Rings, longer than Lord of the Rings, extended edition, right? It'd be a long movie, full of a lot of blood and some crazy stuff. It'd be awesome. Someone should make that movie. But anyway, but I almost see it, the movie ends with them closing the coffin. But you know what happens after every Marvel movie? After the credits roll? You get a post-credit scene. You usually get two, right? You get post-credit scenes that tease a sequel that is coming. And I almost pictured Genesis is ending, and then the post-credit scene would be a little baby Moses in a basket down the river, teasing what is to come. And you see, this is paving the way for this story that eventually God's people are going to be rescued out of Egypt after things go sour. And eventually they're going to go on this long, crazy journey through the wilderness. And then it's going to take you all the way up to the book of Joshua when they finally go into this promised land and they fight all these wars. And this is what ultimately Joseph was seeing forward. He's there's going to be a day where things are going to change. There's going to be a day where God has something greater for us. But you see, Joseph wasn't just foreseeing to when they would go to the promised land. Joseph was foreseeing something that would take place and ultimately come to form at the very end of the Bible. In the very last book of the Bible, in Revelation chapter 21, I think we get to see a picture of kind of what God put on the hearts of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob and of Joseph, is that there is something better in this life. That I have a new life for you that's just going to blow your mind. That's going to be so much greater than you can imagine. And when we go from the beginning to the very end of this book we call the Bible, in chapter 21 of Revelation, listen to these words starting in verse 1. It says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. Think about that for a second. In Genesis, we saw God create the heavens and earth in Genesis chapter 1. And in Revelation, he's creating a new heaven and a new earth. And it says this, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away and the sea was no more. I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne. Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them, and they will be their God. Verse 4, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more because the previous things have passed away. This new world has no sin. This new world has no death. This new life never ends. In verse 5, it says, then the one seated on the throne said, look, I am making everything new. Because these words are faithful and true. Then he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will freely give to the thirsty from the spring of the water of life. And I love in verse 7 kind of how this just wraps up this first little section here. It says, the one who conquers will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. How awesome is this? That Genesis starts with a God who created everything. But quickly, the problem of sin came into our world. And with the problem of sin came the presence of death that we just cannot escape from. But there's this promise that eventually God will come and restore everything. And this promise is not just given in Genesis, it's continually given throughout the Bible. If you read, all you see is this promise that's like, God's making things new. God's gonna make it new. It's gonna get better. That there's a new life in him, that you don't have to be satisfied with this old stuff, but it's gonna be better and greater. And we see a picture of what that promise realized fully looks like in Revelation. Look at the descriptions. It says no more death. There's no more grief. There's no more crying. There's no more pain. It's a new creation, a new heaven, and a new earth, and a new life for us as sons and daughters of God. You see, the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, it promises us this new life. With the very last book, it shows us ultimately what this new life will look like. And what I love is in between, it points to everything that makes this possible. Galatians chapter 3, verse 26, it says, through faith, you are all sons of God in Christ Jesus. You see, Genesis starts with saying like, hey, God created this, but we messed it up. But guess what? God's gonna fix it all again. And he shows us at the very end what this finished, perfect, beautiful project looks like. But then you're like, well, how do I get there? And the rest of the Bible tells us, by this guy named Jesus, by God who came down to earth, who lived a perfect life, who died on a cross for our sins, who raised again to defeat death so that we can experience this promise in him. Let me summarize this, and usually I do kind of quick key thoughts that you can remember. You may not remember this whole key thought, but I want to put it on the screen. We're going to leave it on the screen for a little bit here. And because this is going to be a mouthful. But here's our key thought in kind of summarizing all we've kind of talked about in the book of Genesis and kind of what goes forward is that the Bible starts with a promise of something greater. It ends with presenting what that greater is. And in between, it pushes us to a faith in Jesus that makes it all possible. Think about that for a second. The Bible tells us, like, I know things aren't great right now, but they can be better in your life. God has a plan for you. That's better than your situation you're in. And maybe you try to do the same things over and over again, you get the same dang results, and you're so frustrated, you're so mad. You're like, why isn't that family member getting in line? Why am I myself not getting in line? Why is this job not opening up? Why is it this way? And the Bible starts with God continually telling his people, hey, there's something better out there, and I'm gonna provide it. And then when we fast forward to the end, to Revelation, God shows us something better that's something we can't create, something that we can't even imagine, that we can't even scratch the surface in. And the rest of the entire Bible is pointing us to, hey, this is only possible through faith in Jesus Christ. That is the starting point. That is the middle point and the ending point of how we realize the promise that God has for us. And today, as we kind of end this service, I'm gonna kind of push you to have a time of prayer. But leading up to that prayer time, I want you to do some thinking. And I'm gonna give you a few minutes to think about this, and then I'm gonna kind of give you a little bit of time of what to pray about in this time. But here's what I want you to reflect on and think about. is ask yourself, where is my relationship with God? And you can give a lot of superficial answers to that, but you're not giving this answer to anyone else. You're giving it to yourself. So you can lie right now, but you're just lying to yourself, and God already knows where your heart's at. But reflect for a little bit. Where is my relationship with God?